صلوات الله تغشى أشراف الرسل الأطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب صلوات الله تغشى أشراف الرسل الأطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب أقبل السعد علينا والهنا من كل جانب فلنا البشرى بسعد جاءنا من خير واهب يا جمالا قد تجلى بالمشارق والمغارب مرحبا أهلا وسهلا بك يا خير الحبايب صلوات الله تغشى أشراف الرسل الطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب مرحبا أهلا بشمس قد محت كل الغياهب مرحبا أهلا بشمس خافيت فيها الكواكب يا شريف الأصل لذنا بك في كل النوائب أنت ملجأ كل عاصٍ أنت مأوى كل تائب صلوات الله أشرف الرسل الأطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب جئت من أصل أصيل حل في أعلى الذوائب من قصي ولؤي باذخ المجد بن غالب واعتلى مجدك فخرا في رفيعة المراتب لا بارحنا في سرور بك يا علي المناقب صلوات الله تغشى أشراف الرسل الطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب فلا كم يوما وجودك ظهرت فينا عجائب بشرتنا بالعطايا والأمان والرغائب قد شربنا من صفانا بك من أحلى المشارب فلرب الحمد حمدا جل أن يحصيه حاسب وله الشكر على ما قد حبانا من مواهب يا كريما يا رحيما جد وعجل بالمطالب صلوات الله أشرف الرسل الأطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب من توجه نحو بابك ما رجع من ذاك خائب واغفر ذنب عبد قد أتى نحوك تائب من توجه نحو بابك ما رجع من ذاك خائب واغفر ذنب عبد قد أتى نحوك تائب صلوات الله تغشى أشراف الرسل الأطيب وتعم الآل جمعا ما بدا نور الكواكب اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله صلوا عليه.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, to reiterate the same sentiments of Ustad Amjad, it's always a blessing to be here with you all, and alhamdulillah, exciting now that we are starting our study of the Iḥyā Ulūm anew. And many of you, or perhaps most of you, have been here in some of the previous retreats, but for some of you this might be your first retreat. Welcome to all of you, whether this is your first time or you've been here before. The nature of this book is that you could say in a sense that it is cyclical. In other words, is that as soon as that you finish the Iḥyā Ulūm, you want to start it again. And there is an incredibly beautiful, intentional architecture that Imam Ghazali was a spiritual engineer. He was not only a spiritual doctor, but he's also a spiritual engineer. And there is a blueprint and a very clear, intentional architecture to the Iḥyā Ulūm. And of course, that it begins, and Ustad Amjad gave a brief summary of the four different quarters and the two halves of the book. And the linchpin of this book are the two books, that the one we studied last time, where we did the Khatam, book 20, and then book 21. These two books are right at the heart of the entire Iḥyā Ulūm. Of course, book 21 is on the heart. And when we now enter into the Ruba' al-Muhlikat, the quarter on destructive vices, it necessitates that we understand the centrality, the importance, the foundational nature of the heart. And this is why that Imam Ghazali called this book the Kitabu Ajaib al-Qalb. It is on the marvels or on the wonders of the heart. And I wanted to thank Ustad Amjad for the very beautiful introduction. And he set the tone very nicely to really cement in our minds. And unfortunately, is that we have to go about this process to have it cemented in our minds that the heart is the foundation of this whole matter. And this is something that we want by way of tarbiyah, by the way of nurturing the upcoming generation when they grow up in a household with parents that are Muslim, when that they go to school from the time that they're young. This should already be cemented in their minds and that imprinted completely on their hearts. And it's in an unfortunate reality that we have to spend so much time convincing people that this is actually really the case. This is our deen. This is our deen, simply. And it's only when we understand this reality where then we'll be able to start doing what it is that we need to do to get ourselves out of the predicament that we're in as individuals, as families, as communities, and as the Ummah of our Prophet ﷺ. Simple as that. And we want to get to the point where we don't have to, it's not a waste of time, but where we don't have to exert any of that energy anymore. Everything that it is that we do, this understanding is what needs to be there for all of that work to really bring about its true effect. And this is one of the reasons why this particular book is so important. Another reason is this particular book of the Iḥyā, book 21, Kitab Sharh Ajaib al-Qalb, is a great example of this beautiful synthesis between what is known as aql and naql, ulum al-aqliya wal ulum al-naqliya. That is, the rational sciences and the transmitted sciences. And of course, Imam Ghazali was a master. He was a master of the sciences of ilm al-kalam, theology. He was a master of fiqh, of jurisprudence. He was a master of usul al-fiqh and many other disciplines. And at the same time, is that he was someone who was go back to the early of what would be considered to be theology in the West. Human history. But you're not going to really appreciate that if you don't. But to get into the tradition itself, beyond the basic primers, the matum, which are the backbone of knowledge and are very helpful, or to summarize what it is that you need to know in a very short period of time, and sometimes didactic poems to facilitate memorization, which is part and parcel of learning the transmitted sciences. We've got to get beyond that. We've got to move into the depths, and there's no way for us to really provide an alternative or know what it is that we need to work in the fields that we need to clear the forest of and to make contributions without doing this. And of course, the key to that, most of that, not exclusively, is the Arabic language, but if we really wanted this, we're going to actually have to add a few other languages to the repertoire, including Persian, including a language like Turkish, including a language like Urdu, and you could add a few others. We're going to really do what it is that we need to do over the next 50 to 100 years. All of that is a tangent, but let's get back to the heart. Without this understanding, none of that is possible. We want to get back to this understanding. Now, before we move into the fakir specific topic, which session 2 is on the inner reality of the human being, and we intentionally left the language vague. Okay, we call it the inner reality of the human being. We left it vague intentionally because we're going to get into some of the mustalahat, that is the technical terms, that are used to describe the composite nature of the internal reality of the human being. But what we want to say here in general is the human being has an external reality, and then there is an internal reality, and we want to look at some of these terms. But before we do that, I really wanted to emphasize a few statements here of Imam al-Ghazali that he mentions here in his introduction, because it is so important. And again, that you have in grammar, in Arabic grammar, is that you have what is called tawkid ma'nawi and tawkid lafzi. You have all different ways that you can emphasize things by using other particles, by using various constructions. But then you also have what is called a tawkid lafzi, whereas you just repeat the same word twice. So if I would say to you, in English, watch out, or be careful, or there's a fire over there. If I repeat the same word twice, is that it's emphasizing the importance of that thing. So there's something to be said for emphasis. But let's look at this here, because he says here right from the very beginning, أَمَّا بَعْدْ فَشَرَفَ الْإِنسَانِ وَفَضِيلَتُهُ. The honor and excellence of insan, humankind, or we could simply say in English, man, which of course includes the female gender. And here, when we understand this, what he's saying here is human beings have been chosen by Allah over all of the creation, over the animal kingdom, over the plant kingdom, over the mineral kingdom, human beings are unique. Human beings are special. So of everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in his unimaginably large and vast universe, we are right at the center of all of that, which the blessed lines of poetry that Ustad Amjad quoted to indicates this. And those lines that he mentioned are extremely, extremely significant. And in understanding those lines is that you can get out of the quagmire of the subject-object dichotomy, which gets a little bit complicated, that the Western world is trapped in and simply can't get out. Because is that if that is true, what is being said, وَفِيكَ انْطَوَى الْعَالَمَ الْأَكْبَرُ, the greater cosmos is all contained within you. In other words, when that veil is lifted and you see, you're not seeing anything external. Thus, that you see it as a subject-object dichotomy, is that everything that is external is already within you, so it's already within you, which is really significant. And to get further into that, we'd get into an area where that Imam al-Ghazali is committed to ulum al-mu'amala, the knowledge of dealing, so that you and I can travel the spiritual path to experience what we can from those realities. But here, this is important understanding, is that human beings have a sharaf, they have an honor, they have a fadila, there is an excellence to them. And what makes us excellent and what gives us our honor? It is nothing other than the heart of the human being. And why? Because the human being is different, as he says here, than all other creations, بِاسْتِعْدَادِهِ لِمَعْرِفَةِ اللَّهِ, because of our ability to know Allah. Why is the human being different from everything else in creation? Because we have the ability to know Allah. So do the jinn, and so do the malaika, the angels. This is why these three are what you could call the consciousness of the universe, the Ruh al-Alameen. And this is a valid interpretation of Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of the worlds. Is that? One interpretation is that of the ins, jinn, and the humankind, because they're the Ruh al-Alameen. Those three classifications of Allah's creation are the Ruh, they're the spirit of creation, they're the consciousness of creation. They are the ones that Allah has given the ability to know Him. Now, everything in creation to a degree has knowledge of Allah. Everything is glorifying Allah. Animals are glorifying Allah. Plants and all inanimate objects are glorifying Allah. But they do not know Allah in the way that you and I have the ability to know Allah. This is what makes us unique. But then if that is true, which it is, that is the greatest reality that we must come to understand. How do we come to know Allah? And I point to my chest here because that there is a relationship, as we will soon see, between the physical heart and the metaphysical spiritual heart. It's with our heart. The heart is the mahal nadhar al-haq. It is the locus, the seat, the place of the gaze of the truth subhanahu wa ta'ala. The heart is the vessel through which you and I come to know Allah. So when we talk about ma'rifatullah, which is the purpose of life, which is to come to know Allah, this is why we have been chosen over everything else Allah ta'ala has created. This relates to the heart. So in other words, if we deny the existence of the spiritual part, as we will soon see with what Imam al-Ghazali says, you are not able to truly understand anything. There's nothing you can truly understand. Even if you understand the things of this world, you're only understanding the surface level of things, and you will be from those that Allah Ta'ala says, يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They know the outward of this world, وَهُمْ عَنَ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. And they, in relation to the hereafter, are heedless. So this is really, really important. And so he then goes on to say, he is prepared. وَإِنَّمَا اسْتَعَدْ لِلْمَعْرِفَةِ بِالْقَلْبِ. The only way for us to prepare, to become people of ma'rifah, is with our heart. And I really want people, alhamdulillah, it is in your booklet, read this statement over and over again. This is what we're going to reflect on tomorrow morning, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But I wanted to just mention one more statement here, two more statements rather, of Imam Ghazali, that he goes on to say, وَهُوَ الَّذِي إِذَا عَرَفَهُ الْإِنسَانِ فَقَدْ عَرَفَ نَفْسَهُ. The heart is that which, if the human being knows it, that knows his self in reality. Because the reality of the human being has to be that dimension of the human being where you to strip everything else away, that it still remains. So the reality of the human being is beyond our features. It's beyond the color of the eyes, the color of the skin, whether we are tall, whether we are short, whatever all these differentiating factors outwardly, it is beyond that. Were you to lose your arm, you still are who you are. Were your skin, God forbid, to be burned, you still are who you are. The reality of you has to be such where all of these things outwardly stripped from you, you remain. And that is your heart. And when you come to know your heart, there's no way to truly know ourselves without knowing our heart. وَإِذَا عَرَفَ نَفْسُ فَقَدْ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ. And when we know ourselves, we know our Lord. There's no way to know Allah without knowing ourselves. So what can a civilization truly offer if they are not giving you a knowledge of the self? What can a civilization truly offer you? It is going to be extremely limited. A lot of comforts maybe, things of your life might be made easier, but what really can it offer you if it's not giving you a knowledge of your own self, which is a prerequisite at many levels and in many ways of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? First and foremost, the most outward dimension, if you recognize certain traits within yourself and you understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that has that traits that are very absolutely different to your traits. We have weakness, he has power, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so forth. But then look at what he says here. وَهُوَ الَّذِي إِذَا جَهِلُ الْإِنسَانِ فَقَدْ جَهِلَ نَفْسَهُ وَإِذَا جَهِلَ نَفْسَهُ فَقَدْ جَهِلَ رَبَّهُ. If we are ignorant of our own selves, we will be ignorant of our Lord. وَمَنْ جَهِلَ قَلْبَهُ فَهُوَ بِغَيْرِهِ أَجْهَلُ. This is of the utmost importance. Whoever is ignorant of his heart, his internal reality, how he truly is, he will be even more ignorant of everything else. In other words, is that if you and I do not know our hearts, we cannot have true knowledge of anything. True knowledge. You can know things outwardly, but you won't be able to have true knowledge. Because then this gets down to our definition of what true knowledge actually really is. And then finally, فَمَعْرِفَةِ الْقَلْبِ. And again, we want this to be cemented in your mind. Knowledge of the heart. وَحَقِيقَةَ أَوْصَافِهِ. So knowledge of the heart and knowledge of the reality of its traits, its internal realities. أَصْلُ الدِّينِ. It's the foundation of the deen. Knowledge of the heart and the true nature of its traits is the foundation of the religion. Asl ad-Deen, the foundation of the religion. Wa asasu tariq as-salikin, and it is the foundation of the way of those taking the path to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no reality to any edifice without a foundation. There is no reality to our deen and our practice of it without this knowledge that the heart is right at the center. And there's no reality to the spiritual path, which the whole goal in life is to know Allah, without knowledge of the heart. So without placing this reality at the center of our understanding of the deen, our deen is going to be deficient, and there's no reality to the spiritual path, which is the way that we can then fulfill our purpose in life. And thus, we come out of that understanding. This is what we need to spend our life doing, is that rooted in an understanding of the heart, rooted in an approach where we are constantly going through the process of building the meanings of our heart, purifying our heart. then to the extent that we do this, as well as all of the outward things, is to the degree which that we will have true impact in a good way on the world that is around us. So this doesn't mean, as some people think, is that by focusing on this is that you're just going to become a recluse and not have any impact upon the world. Even Imam al-Ghazali in his post-Nizamiya stage, he still remained somewhat detached from many of the institutions of his time and was doing his work. And for those that paint the picture of Imam al-Ghazali, that he became a recluse, that's just an incorrect understanding. How can a mujaddid, a renewer of the deen, be a recluse? It's a prerequisite, as the ulama say, is that in commenting on the hadith that relates to at the turn of every century, they say the mujaddid at the turn of the century has to be zahir wa yudhhir ilmuh. He has to be that outwardly, that's spreading his knowledge at the turn of the century. So Imam al-Ghazali was a mujaddid, and so how could he have had that that description of being recluse and totally detached? No, what it means is that he wasn't working within the existing institutions, but he was as active as you could possibly be, but with this knowledge, laying down these foundations. And just think about what he did. Think about how many countless people from the time that he lived, 950 years ago roughly, until now, have benefited from this book. How many people have been transformed by this book? How many people then have made some of the greatest contributions that human beings can make across the spectrum as a result of this knowledge and this book? So it's the contrary to what people think. By focusing on the heart, what it does is it allows you to make true contributions that are going to be of true benefit. And for all of the good that Muslims are doing, even in a country like the United States of America or in Canada or in other places, the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, how principled are these contributions? And what we mean by principled is they have to be rooted in a person who is rooted in their iman, their Islam, and their ihsan. If you're not rooted in iman, Islam, and ihsan, what is going to be the true worth of that contribution? If you compromise at the level of belief, if you compromise at the level of the law, or you compromise at the level of the spirit, what benefit is going to really come from that? If it is that it will be that type of benefit that Imam al-Ghazali warns us of, is you don't want to be a candle that lights for other people, but you burn your own self. You want to benefit in addition to that benefiting others. In order to do that, the contributions have to be principled. And this is, and I hope people listen to this very carefully, one of the most important things as we move forward as a community here in a place like the United States of America or some of the other places that were mentioned. We must make principled contributions. Muslims are engaging. Muslims are already engaging. But how many of the contributions that are being made are contributions where you and I are uniquely bringing out that fresh and new perspectives based upon our blessed deen to the people that are around us? Were we only to realize how much people need what it is that we have? But our job is to go into more detail, to understand things in more depth so that we can bridge that gap between people so they can see the relevance of this deen to every single aspect of their life. Every single aspect of their life, not just worship. And this is why the task ahead of us in order to do this over the next 50 to 100 years is huge. But the starting point is understanding this knowledge. So after that introduction, what Imam al-Ghazali then does is he goes into the next chapter. And this is the bayanu ma'na al-nafsi wa ruhi wal qalbi wa ma huwa al-murad bi hadhihi al-asami. He's going to offer an exposition, a bayan, on the meaning of the word nafs. And I don't want people to get caught up on translation right now, okay? Because this is one of the things Imam al-Ghazali even points out to is sometimes we get caught up on the translations of the words as opposed to understanding the reality. So I will use translations here to clarify them, but after that I'm going to just use the Arabic term because I don't want people to get caught up on the translation of the word. Rather, we want to understand the meaning of these words. So he's going to talk about the meaning of the nafs, and we're just going to translate that as soul. Okay? It could also be translated as ego. It could also be translated as self or lower self, and maybe even other ways. But think of it as nafs. And this is one instance, unless we're talking to someone who's not Muslim, but even using the word soul would likely confuse someone because sometimes people use soul and spirit interchangeably. But again, put that all aside. There's a reality to the human being in that internal nature, that to the nafs. So the first word is nafs. And he's also going to speak about the ruh. And the ruh is the spirit. The ruh. Wal qalb. Qalb is heart. And then the aql. The aql is the intellect. So what is the murad? What is intended by these meanings? Now, before that we get into what he's going to tell us here, it is important that we understand there is a Quranic vocabulary for these words. And 3 of those 4 that we just mentioned are explicitly mentioned in the Book of Allah. The qalb, the ruh, and the nafs are explicitly mentioned in the Book of Allah. The word aql is not mentioned in the Quran. It is mentioned in verbal form. And in that, there's something really, there's a latifa, there's a beautiful, subtle point that is very powerful. When the Quran uses the word yaqilun or ta'qilun in verbal form, this indicates that the whole purpose of the intellect is to use it, as opposed to sit around and to pontificate and to overly philosophize for the sake of philosophizing. The whole purpose of the intellect is to understand wahi, to understand revelation. This is the purpose of the intellect, is to understand revelation and then to act according to it. This is the purpose of the aql. This is why we were given an aql. And then by extension, that to do what it is that we need to do in the world. But the foundational purpose of the intellect is not just to think for the sake of thinking or to philosophize for the sake of philosophizing. Yes, that you use it, but the point is to actually use it to understand revelation and to put it into practice and to do good in creation and to bring about masalih, things of benefit for Muslims and non-Muslims, for all of humanity, and that everything else in the world, so that people can flourish in their worldly lives and then more importantly, in the hereafter. That's what the aql is for. So when we use the word aql, it is mentioned explicitly in statements, hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but not in the Quran in that nominal form as a noun. But there are 3 other words as well that are also, now Imam al-Ghazali doesn't go into this, so this is kind of a preamble to what Imam al-Ghazali is going to teach us, that are also mentioned in the Quran. This is the word sadr, fu'ad, and lub. Sadr, fu'ad, and lub. Okay? Now, before moving on, there are 3 meanings. When we use the word qalb, there are 3 ways that we can refer to it. Okay? Just as when we talk about Islam, we can talk about Islam as the Deen of Islam. So imagine here Islam, and then stemming from it are 3 pillars. Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. I just said this is Islam here. So you could talk about Islam and talk about the Deen in its entirety. Or you could talk about Islam insofar as it's one of the 3 pillars of the Deen. Iman, Islam and ihsan. So it depends on what you mean by it. Similarly, the qalb. You could talk about the qalb and use it interchangeably with this ambiguous reference that we have here, inner reality. And that's why we didn't put heart there, because we don't want you to get confused until you get this explanation. There's an internal reality to the human being. And the internal reality of the human being is one that is of a composite nature. And I'm getting ahead of myself. That bullet point was actually coming. But just as our physical body is composite, i.e. made up of parts, we have hands, we have legs, we have that different body parts, we have anatomy, we have all these different aspects of our physical body. But if I'd say the body, it refers to all of that. So the body, we use it singularly as one entity, but it's composite because it has different parts. Likewise, the metaphysical heart, the spiritual heart, is composite, i.e., it's made up of different parts, if you will. It has different aspects to it. So when we talk about these different terms, they are referring to different aspects of the internal reality of the human being, that just as the limbs have certain functions, your hands have a function even within your hand. Your fingers and your four fingers have a different function. The index finger is different than the thumb, and so forth and so on, let alone your toes, and let alone the internal anatomy and the other body parts in that beautiful exposition that we heard of, even some of the physical wonders of the heart. Everything in our body has a purpose and has a function, but it's a collective part of our body as a whole. Likewise, our heart, referred to as our internal reality, is composite in nature and has different aspects to it. And as vast and amazing, we just heard about the vascular system, how vast and amazing this is, the human body, what we have just right within us. If that's that amazing in relation to our physical makeup, the heart is even broader. The heart is even vaster. And one of the Salihin said, and using one of the words for the heart, which is fu'ad, he says, Sumiyad fu'ad fu'ada. The fu'ad was called the fu'ad, and here we're just going to translate it as heart. The heart was called the heart, لِأَنَّ فِيهِ أَلْفْ وَاد, because in it is 1,000 valleys. وَفِي كُلِّ وَادٍ أَلْفْ وَاد. And each valley is another 1,000 valleys. So there's 1,000 valleys in the heart. And then each valley of the heart, there's an additional 1,000 valleys. What does this mean? It means is that the heart is vast. The heart is significantly vaster in the world of the heart, in what the heart can experience, than anything that is a part of the physical realm. Yes, including the 200 billion galaxies in our universe. And yes, even beyond that, anything else that Allah Ta'ala has created that is within the sama' dunya, the heart, is beyond that. Of anything and everything that has been created in the sama' dunya, the heart is beyond that. Because it is through the heart that we can experience what Allah Ta'ala has created in the celestial realm. And here, this is when the heart connects to the ruh, as we will see shortly. So, we can refer to the inner reality of the human being as qalb, as the heart. The second way that we refer to it is that the heart as a unique component of the composite nature of our internal reality. So here, when we talk about, we have a nafs, we have a ruh, we have an aql, and we have a qalb. The heart specifically now is one of these components. It's one of these aspects. Okay? Then, when we hone in on the heart itself here, and again, Imam is not going to go into this, I'm just giving you this knowledge because I want us to understand how this is related to the Quranic terminology, is that the heart is the second layer of the heart when we think of it as one of the components. In other words, the heart can be used, the qalb, to refer to the internal reality of the human being. The second usage is one of these specific aspects of that internal reality. The third usage is that we go deeper into understanding the heart as one of these unique components, is that it has 4 different layers. So if you notice that it's included in your book here, is that you'll see 4 circles. So now we're talking about the heart as one of these components. Even that in and of itself has layers. Now this is taken from that that attempt of a scholar to clarify this reality. Okay? And that a book that was written by Hakim al-Tirmidhi. When we use the word sadr, you could translate the sadr as heart. It's not referring to your physical chest here. The sadr is the outermost dimension of the heart in its second meaning. So what does Allah say? Alam nashrah laka sadrak. It is the place of expansion. Alladhi yuwaswisu fi sudurin nas. Shaitan whispers in the sudur, the hearts of people. Shaitan cannot whisper in your qalb in the third meaning. Shaitan cannot whisper in your fu'ad or your lub. He can only whisper in your sadr. And what the scholars have done is they've attempted to look at the various verses of the Quran and look at the various hadith of our Prophet ﷺ to develop a system of understanding these terms. Now it's important to recognize here, and Imam al-Ghazali will say this very soon, this is not definitive. What we really need to know is how to act and what to do with these realities. As for fully understanding them, you're never going to fully understand them with the intellect or alone, with the descriptions that any scholar has given you, because if you go deeper and deeper, you'll find that there's a lot of difference of opinion when it comes to these matters. We don't need to get involved in that difference of opinion because it's not a theoretical discussion. What we want is a working model of how, in general, to understand what we need to know about the inner reality of the heart so that we can do what it is that we need to do to come to know Allah. In other words, even if we don't understand the theory, you could not understand this theory and be an arif billah and know Allah. So more important than understanding the theory is actually living the way that we need to live. And the vast majority of people who are arifin billah can't even articulate the realities of these things, but they're witnessing them. Now, having said that, it does help, and this is why Imam al-Ghazali does it, in a very basic way to understand these terms so to ward off any confusion so we can do what it is that we need to do. So the outermost dimension of the heart in this second meaning is the sadr. Then you could have what you might call the outer heart. Here is when we translate the qalb. Then more subtle than that is the fu'ad, okay, which is the inner heart. Then you have the lub. That Ustad Amjad also mentioned this word. The lub, or they believe it was that Dr. Asad in his khutbah today mentioned the lub. And this is the core of the human being, the innermost being, however it is that you translate it. But what is the meaning of lub here? It is the innermost dimension of the heart. Okay? So the heart can be referred to in these 3 ways. The internal reality of the human being, that as one of the components of this internal reality, or in its third meaning, the second most subtle layer of the heart. Now, I'm actually going to jump ahead and then come back. This wasn't the plan, but I'm kind of changing my plan So one of the easiest ways to understand this, and this is essentially taken from what Imam al-Ghazali says, using a little bit of poetic license to make this clear to us. Now again, this is not a definitive model the way that I'm going to explain this. And there's multiple similitudes that Imam al-Ghazali gives if you actually purchase the book and you can read about it. And the whole point here is not that we obsess over a theoretical model. It's that we understand what it is that we need to know so that we can put this knowledge into practice. Okay, now I want everyone to pay attention here very carefully because this is very important to understand this. Imagine here the heart in the middle, okay, the qalb. Here using the qalb here as the second meaning, a component of the composite nature of the human being. Now it doesn't look like this, but this is only here for taqrib al-afham, to make us understand this, okay? Now imagine the heart actually as a circle. And imagine that another circle here, overlapping with this circle, and this is the ruh. Imagine another circle over here, overlapping with the qalb, and this is the nafs. Okay, now if you would draw a line down here like this is the material world here, and this is the world of the unseen. So the heart is a barzakh. It is a barzakh for the material world and the immaterial world. And insofar it is connected to the material world, it is connected to it through the nafs. I'm not going to translate the word nafs anymore. Insofar as connected to the immaterial world, it is connected to the ruh, the spirit. When we talk about the ascent and the descent of the human being, the more the material world influences us negatively, the more that our nafs gets a grip over us, is that the more that the human being descends and falls to the asfad as-safilin, to the lowest of the low. The more that the heart is dominated by the ruh, the more that the human being ascends and rises to the a'la illiyin, the highest of the high. The heart is where this is all taking place. It is the battleground. It is the reality of when we talk about mujahada, spiritual struggle, that's at the level of the heart. Now, how do we understand this a little bit deeper? The heart is where all of this is taking place. And because it's connected to the nafs in and of itself has 3 degrees. Some of them will talk about 7. For our purposes, we only need to talk about 3. The nafs in its unrefined state is ammara bisu. It incites to evil. The nafs, when it starts to become purified, moves to stage 2, is the nafs al-lawwama. And because Allah swears by the nafs al-lawwama, the reproachful soul, we know that it's something good. When the nafs becomes purified, it reaches a degree of what's called a nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil soul. So the nafs has 3 stages. The vast majority of human beings are in the stage of al-ammara bisu. Ammara, the nafs that is constantly inciting to evil. Your nafs, if you want to think about it very simply, is who you are. Your nafs is you. Now, sometimes we speak to ourselves as if that ourselves are external to us. But the reality is your nafs is you. And it's from here is that we need to learn, and yes, we need to learn to criticize ourselves. And we should reach a point where we are so critical of ourselves, and I'll clarify, because some people might think, well, what about self-esteem and all these other things? We'll save that for the interactive session, these detailed discussions. But we should reach a point where we criticize ourselves so heavily that no matter what anyone says to us, it doesn't affect us because we've already criticized ourselves significantly more than any of our critics. Imam al-Ghazali mentions a statement of one of the awliya that said is that no one can criticize me in a way that I've not already only criticized myself. This is why one of the righteous is that someone saw him walking and he says, Ya munafiq. Imagine if someone came up to you, like a loved one or your spouse or friend, said, you're a hypocrite. Right? Imagine me, right? Well, that a person who, I already believe I'm a hypocrite. I already fear hypocrisy. Right? This is why when that person said that to the man walking, he says like, finally someone's calling me by my true name. But in a very real way. We should be so critical of ourselves because we don't need people in pseudo-spirituality or in leadership or in these to tell us is that the foundation of everything is being critical of yourself and always leaning to improve. We know this from our deen. There's no way to improve if we're not self-critical. We're not talking about being self-critical for the sake of being self-critical and beating ourselves over the head and so that we don't ever do anything. No, we're talking about being self-critical so that we can recognize our faults and we can work on them. Not so that we can just give up. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about that a calculated, that self-criticism, so that we can improve, so that we can constantly work on ourselves. And the way to get over the nafsi nature and the whisperings of the shaytan when it comes to this, shaytan will try to keep you down and try to get you to obsess over your faults so much so that you give up and don't think that you can ever do anything, and that will trap you in imposter syndrome and all these other types of modern ways of referring to it. We're all imposters. That's the reality. But we know what it is that we're trying to be like. And we're never going to give up, even if we are imposters. Even if we fall short tonight in something that we said that we know that we should be putting into practice, we refuse to give up. Because we know that Allah is the most merciful of the merciful. And He is the one who's going to judge us, not other people. And it's up to Him whether or not you and I enter into paradise and we become successful, not any other person on the face of this earth. And that gives us comfort that no matter how much we fall short, no matter how much we are really imposters and how much nifaq or any other fault problems that we have with ourselves or faults or disease of the heart, is that Allah is the one who's going to ultimately judge us, and He is the one that has made despairing from His mercy a major sin. It's not an option to give up. The third level of the nafs is where the nafs becomes tranquil. Your nafs is you. So what happens here is that the more spiritual struggle that we put in, the more you move up in the degrees. Now, an important caveat here. So we said here the circle is the qalb. Connected to it, but related to the side of the material world is the nafs. Inside the nafs is the hawa, is the desire. And your desires are your shahawat. This is your attachment to this world. Food, drink, sleep, the opposite gender, status, fame, money, and even at the highest degree, yes, even knowledge. These are our attachments to the world. And part of the spiritual path is striving against ourselves to get beyond the natural inclination that we have to the things of the world, which, again, oftentimes in this science, we think of these shahawat as negative and bad, but they're not all bad. There's a divine wisdom behind them. If you didn't have a desire to eat, how would you ever even eat? How would you go about doing the things that you need, and how would people that have worldly lives if we didn't have these desires? So they become negative if we end up doing something that is haram in terms of how we fulfill that desire. Or is it we go to excess in them such that they cloud the heart and blind it? That's when it becomes negative. As for the shahawat in of themselves, is that if we praise Allah and that see Him, as we again heard today in the beautiful khutbah, as the giver of blessings, then this becomes a means for us to draw near to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have the qalb, then you have the nafs. Inside the nafs is the hawa. This is our connection to the things of this world. Then on the other side, you have the ruh. The ruh is the spirit. We don't know much about it. The ruh is the spirit. But we know that the ruh is the alated mahabba. It is, when we talk about it as one component or an aspect of our internal nature, the function of the ruh is to love Allah. The function of the qalb is to know Allah. So when we talk about love of Allah, that's with our spirit. And of course, is that our spirit is in our physical bodies. And to what degree do we say that is connected to our physical body? How to fully understand that, we don't know. But it's amazing to think that spirit and clay are opposites, that Allah Ta'ala has gathered in us opposites. So the human beings are the ultimate synthesizers. If we can synthesize by the power of Allah between our spirit and between our physical body, not we, Allah is the one who's done that. What can we not synthesize as human beings? We have an incredible capacity as Bani Adam. And ultimately, the spirit's function is to help us ascend to the heavenly realm. Is that where we are here outwardly with our physical bodies, but our hearts are attached to the higher realms. And this is one of the beautiful statements of Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, صاحب الدنيا بأبدانهم, is that they that lived here in this world with their physical bodies, meaning they were in the world but not of their worlds. But قلوبهم معلقة بالملأ الأعلى, but their hearts were attached to the celestial heaven, to what Allah Ta'ala is in store of those who are in His presence, the Malal A'la, the Supreme Assembly, Ascension. This is with the Ruh. And so what happens here is that the more that the heart gives into the nafs and becomes clouded by the desires that arise in it, especially if it's in an unlawful fashion, the harder the heart becomes, the more darkened the heart becomes, the less access that the heart has to the ruh. The more that you and I focus on the ruh and to focus on what elevates the human being, following the thoughts of angels, and where we're going to repeat much of what I'm saying tonight in the session number 6 tomorrow, because this is also important to understand in terms of how we make decisions and exercise our volition. But the more we give victory, if you will, to the ruh, the more that we focus on building this spiritual dimension of the human being, is that the more pure the heart becomes, the more illuminated the heart becomes, the more open and expanded the heart becomes, the more radiant the heart becomes, and so forth and so on, and expansive and all these other beautiful meanings. So you start to see how this is the essence of the human predicament, and understanding this basic model, which is a simple model, to give us the most basic understanding of how the composite nature of our internal reality works together. Okay, so again, you have the heart in the middle, attached to it is the nafs, inside the nafs is the hawa, and this is the material world. On the other side, you have the ruh, which is attached to the unseen, the immaterial world, and the goal of the human being is to give victory to the ruh over the nafs. And the more that we give victory to the ruh over the nafs, the more that we move up from nafs al-amara to nafs al-lawama to nafs al-mutma'inna. Okay? From the self that incites to evil, to the upbraiding soul, to the reproachful soul, to the tranquil soul. Now, the last component here is, that we want to understand, is the aql, the intellect. The intellect, imagine that it is looking down upon the heart, the nafs, and the ruh. The intellect is that dimension of the internal reality of the human being that relates to knowledge. And it relates to that our ability to choose what Allah Ta'ala wants us to do. So there is a lower level of the intellect, which you could say roughly is housed in the brain. And this is our ability to do many of the functions that we need as human beings to get through life, including many of the sciences that relate to worldly sciences. The reality of the intellect, though, is housed in the heart. And it becomes, in its higher meaning, not just knowledge in and of itself, but how it is that we know as human beings. And of course, these things are asrar, they're secrets. We're talking about alfad, expressions to refer to these realities. Yes, it's possible when someone treads the spiritual path that Allah will give them unveilings, will they'll understand in a lot more detail what the reality of the nafs and the ruh and the qalb and the aql is. But what we need to know is simply that, is that the aql relates to knowledge. In particular here, it has to be fueled by a knowledge of the sacred law, tamam, as well as good thinking skills. Because the function of the intellect is to oversee the battle that is taking place at the level of the heart. And the function then is to give victory to the ruh. Because the aql is meant to think about consequences. It's meant to think about the results of things, if we're truly using it appropriately. So in this meaning, the aql is juxtaposed to the hawa. The hawa is fickle, it's volatile. That you could just be sitting and all of a sudden have this crazy desire that I want a smoothie from Wawa, right? And you start thinking about Wawa and what you're going to order, and you might even be putting your order now. As soon as you have to wait, the session's almost over, and he's already late as usual, going over in the session. And just all of a sudden just have a desire to go to Wawa, right? And this is the way. But then you might have a desire after that, like, oh, I'm going to check my social media account. Or I'm going to, how can that? Your desire blows like the wind. Whereas the aqd is stable. The aqd is that entity that thinks about what happens if I follow these fickle desires. So it's on the completely, when we say juxtaposed, that means on the completely opposite side of the spectrum. Now, that really suffices us. What Imam al-Ghazali does here, we kind of summarized what he covers in these few pages. Essentially, what Imam al-Ghazali does is he talks about each one of these terms. And what he says about them, he says each one of these terms, qalb, qalb, nafs, ruh, and aql, they have a lower meaning and a higher meaning. And he opens this chapter by saying is that some of the scholars who have talked about these different realities have confused certain things. And Imam al-Ghazali wants us to have clarity. So when he talks about the heart, he says, we're not referring here to the pine cone shaped piece of flesh that's in the human being. That's something that we learn in anatomy in a discussion for physicians. He says that what we're talking about now is the spiritual heart. And the way that he refers to the internal reality of the human being, so he refers to it generally with a description. This is why we also said inner reality. He calls it a latifa rabbaniya ruhaniya. Okay, a latifa is something that is subtle. Something that is subtle. Rabbaniya means it is lordly with a lowercase l, meaning yani mansub Rabb. It's affiliated to the heavenly realm. It's affiliated to its Lord. Ruhaniya means that it has a spiritual nature to it. And this is one way of translating it, but in your translation there, we'll saw that ethereal spiritual sort, yani, that's not how I would necessarily translate that. But that idea of latifa here is that this is something that is not apparent to us in the physical realm. There's a reality to it in the realm of the unseen, but it's something that is very subtle, and it is Rabbani, it's very special, but it's ruhaniya. Has a spiritual nature, and we could even use the word that in a simple sense, metaphysical. So as a latifa rabbaniya ruhaniya, it is the subtly lordly spiritual aspect. Again, when we use the word lordly here, it's with a lowercase l. In English, you can use it in that way. It doesn't mean that it is that divine. La, it's muntasib ila Rabb. So when Allah says, kunu rabbaniyin, is it be lordly? In other words, is that be completely devoted to Allah, be affiliated to Allah in everything that is that you do. What does it mean by Rabbaniya? Is that this is that how we know Allah. So when Allah says, Qul ar-ruhu min amri Rabbi, say the spirit is from the command of my Lord. It doesn't mean that your spirit is Allah or that. A'udhu billah. Right? It means that this reality of the human being is how we know Allah. And of course, it's going to be difficult for us to understand with the unaided intellect. Of course, in the realm of the intellect, there's only so much you can understand. We know what it is that we need to know, that it has a reality. And this dimension of the human being cannot be detected. So any attempt to try to use science to disprove that human beings have a ruh is futile, because the ruh is beyond the realm of science. The qalb, in this meaning, is beyond the realm of science. The nafs, all of these things are metaphysical. They cannot be tested. They don't show up on any type of scan or any type of flashing of neurons. All of that is related to the physical dimension of the human being. But what does he say about وَتِلْكَ اللَّطِيفَةِ? This subtle reality of the human being, هي حقيقة الإنسان. Allahu Akbar. This is the true nature of the human being. Look how important this is. What a blessing to have a deen in our time, in the end of time, 1400 years after our Prophet ﷺ, where we see the dissolution of religion before our eyes and people just abandoning belief in God and having this still to be truth that you and I can hold on to, that we still have this guidance. This reality of the human being is the haqiqat al-insan. And if you try to seek your true reality in any other way, through anything that relates to any of the desires, status, fame, how you look, your physical, any of this stuff, is that you'll never ever be happy. It's impossible ever to be happy, and you'll be blinded from these realities. This is one of the greatest things that Islam can offer the world in the continuation of the prophetic heritage going back to the Prophet Adam, and that for people in our time now who's forgotten what it even means to be a prophet or what even revelation is. One of the greatest things we can offer people in our world that we live in is that your true reality is something internal to you. This is your true reality. And no matter what anyone else says, even if they deny what it is that you're saying, that will resonate with them because they're fitrah. They know this in their natural disposition. It's embedded in them. They're wired to know and intuit this reality. And even if they fight it, to a certain degree, they do know this reality. Whether they're able to submit to it or not, Allahu A'lam. But this is the haqiqah of the insan. It is the reality of the human being. And then he repeats some of what he then repeats in relation to in the introduction. وَهُوَ الْمُدْرِكُ الْعَالِمُ. This is how the human being perceives. This is how the human being knows. وَالْعَرَفُ. This is how he attains gnosis. مِنَ الْإِنسان. وَهُوَ الْمُخَاطَبُ. When we talk about the human being, that being addressed, Allah addresses us, and really was he addressing? He's addressing our heart. وَهُوَ الْمُعَاقِبُ. When we talk about being taken into account and punished, وَالْمُعَاتِبُ وَالْمُطَالَبُ, it's because of ultimately what's in our hearts. And yes, of course, what we do with our limbs, but we don't do anything with our limbs that doesn't first originate in the heart. Everything originates in the heart. Everything. All of our behavior outwardly originates in the heart. So this is how ultimately we are taken into account before Allah Ta'ala. And depending upon the state of our heart will depend on whether or not we are in the abode of paradise, may Allah Ta'ala make us to be from them, or the abode of hell, nasallahu ta'ala, as-salama wal-afiyah. And so then Imam Ghazali says here, if we use this word heart in this book, no, what we're referring to is this latifa, this subtle internal reality of the human being. And our intent here in this book, he says, is ذِكْرُ أَوْصَافِهَا وَأَحْوَالِهَا. We're going to mention its traits and its states. لا ذكر حقيقتها في ذاتها, not mentioning its reality in relation to its essence. Okay? He says, علم المعاملة, the knowledge of dealings. For those that have been here before, remember, there's ilm mu'amala and ilm al-mukashfa, practical knowledge of the deen that we need to know to draw near to him, that requires that we know the traits and states of our heart, not its reality. This is very important. We don't want to obsess over the theory. We learn what it is that we need to know so that we can do what it is that we need to do. So this is what he says about the qalb. Then when he speaks about the ruh, he first mentions what's the knowledge of medicine, how they understood the ruh during their time, and insofar as it relates to medicine. But then he says that the ruh has a higher meaning. And the higher meaning of the ruh is this latifa, is this subtle reality of the human being, meaning that the internal reality of the human being is one. It's composite, it has different aspects, but it's one. And so the real definition, if you will, of the ruh, it is this latifa, it is this subtle reality of the human being that is alima and mudrika, that perceives and knows from the human being. So it overlaps in terms of its definition with the heart. And of course, that it is, as he says, amr ajibun rabbaniya, that it is, the affair of the ruh is amazing, is that the vast majority of people's understanding and intellect are not able to understand its reality. As Allah says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, and they ask you about the spirit. And our Prophet ﷺ, it was one of the 3 questions that the Jews asked him. And the Prophet didn't respond, and this was the response to them. And look at the nature of that question. And look at our Prophet ﷺ conveyed what he was meant to convey. And sometimes the answer is that no, we don't know its reality. We know that it exists, but we don't know its reality. And that in and of itself is the answer. So that's the qalb and the ruh. And then also when we speak about the nafs, we can speak about the nafs in 2 ways. When we speak about the nafs in the lower sense, we speak about it as in relation to the faculties, and this is a complicated word here when we understand in its technical sense, but we need to introduce this now because it will relate to Ustaz Amjad's session in the morning. A faculty essentially is that it's something that exists within you. It's just part of who you are. Just think of it very simply as that. And we have a faculty of desire, quwwat al-shahwa, just as a faculty, and quwwat al-ghadab, a faculty of anger. In other words, is that we as human beings desire certain things, and we have the ability to become angry. And these 2 things are very important because it is through these 2 realities that we obtain benefit and ward off harm. There's a wisdom in them, and he'll talk about that more in detail, inshallah ta'ala. But when we talk about the nafs in its higher meaning, again, it intersects now with the same meaning, i.e. that it's a part of this internal reality of the human being with the qalb and the ruh. It's the haqiqat al-insan. It's the reality of the human being. وَهُوَ النَّفْسُ الْإِنسان. It is the human being himself. وَذَاتُهُ in his essence. Right? But it has different traits based upon its different states. Right? It has different degrees. And this relates to the degrees of the soul. And the more pure the heart becomes, the higher the degree of the soul. So the nafs in and of itself, we usually speak about it as something that is negative. The reality is it's only negative in its lower state. When the nafs becomes mutma'inna, it's no longer negative there. There it's lofty. The nafs al-mutma'inna, Allahu Akbar, is lofty. So it's only negative because of the danger of it pulling you into something that's displeasing to Allah Ta'ala. But when it becomes refined and pure, Allahu Akbar. If Allah swears by it when he talks about the nafs al-lawwama, then what about the nafs al-mutma'inna? Just look in the end of Surah Al-Fajr and how Allah Ta'ala addresses the nafs al-mutma'inna and how gentle. And look what Allah Ta'ala has in store. That ya ayyatuha nafs al-mutma'inna, for this blessed soul, this human being who has desire but has worked on his or herself and then has reached this lofty state. And then finally we have the aqal. The aqal in its lower meaning relates to knowledge, and its higher meaning relates to how it is that we know. And what we come to the conclusion here of is that the internal human reality of the human being has a composite nature. And it has these different aspects: qalb, nafs, ruh, and aqal. And the qalb, for example, as we mentioned, has those layers in and of itself. And Imam al-Ghazali doesn't mention it here. Others will add this. And Imam al-Zabidi mentions this in his commentary on the Iḥyā. Some of them refer to what is called the sir. And that some of them say this is pointed to in Allah's book when he says, يَعْلَمُ السِّرَّ وَأَخْفَى. So it's not explicitly mentioned, it's implicitly mentioned in Allah's book. And what they say is, and this is another way of looking at it, the batin of the qalb is the ruh, the internal dimension. So now think of it as more like an onion, right? The internal dimension of the heart is the ruh. This is very different than the other diagram that I kind of painted. The internal dimension of the ruh is the sir. The sir you might translate as the innermost dimension, the innermost secret rather, the sir. And the function of the sir is shuhud, divine witnessing. And then there's different adhkar that the shuyukh give you that open up the qalb, that open up the ruh, and then open up the sir. And this is what the true inheritors of the prophets do, is that they give you everything that it is that you need to know, outwardly and inwardly. And ultimately what we want is the perfect balance between the outward and the inward. And as a blessing from Allah Ta'ala, as that if Muslims tend to lean towards one end of the scale than the other, they tend to lean towards the scale of being more focused on the outward, not the inward. But there's a secret in that, because it's much easier then to maintain balance if that's the case. If you go astray in relation to the inward, how are you going to get it back? It confuses people. This is why when people talk about spiritualities, when they're not really permitted to do so, and this is why they lead so many people astray, because they're so much harder to correct. If they make a mistake outwardly into the sacred law, anyone can correct them because the knowledge is there. And so there's a mercy. But ultimately what we want is perfect balance in our deen. If you will, you can say to balance the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. But ultimately the way we would refer to it is that balancing the zahir and the batin. Perfect balance between Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And everything that is that we do, we have a response from Ihsan, a response from Iman, and a response from Iman, a response from Islam, a response from Ihsan. In any given situation, we have to look at things through a theological, legal, and spiritual lens. And that when we're able to do this, we put everything in its proper place. So Imam al-Ghazali mentioning this is there to help us understand generally what is this internal reality of the human being, so that we can then move on to do what it is that we need to do. Now, why did he place it here? Because he's going to speak about these internal states of the heart. The vast majority of the third quarter, i.e. books 21 to 30, are about the muhlikat, the destructive vices of the heart. These are the things that lead us astray as human beings. The vast majority of the fourth quarter of the Iḥyā is on the munjiyat, the saving virtues. So this is what he means by the sifat, the traits, and the ahwal, the states of the heart. What's going on in this internal dimension of the human being? What are our thoughts? How does that relate to it? Desires, inclinations, intentions, that envy, jealousy, arrogance, as opposed to patience, gratitude, love, contentment, all these different things, that whisperings of the shaytan, all these different traits of the heart, all these different aspects of the heart, all these different states of the heart. We have to know this, because our everlasting abode of the hereafter that we are moving towards in every single moment depends upon this knowledge. And at the most basic level, learning this is fard ayn. It is an individual obligation that we learn the basics of this, i.e. that which it is that we need to know to return to Allah safely. It is fard ayn. We don't have a choice. We must learn it. And alhamdulillah, there are short texts that explain that you can learn the basics of this in a few hours or even less than that. But then we want to spend our lives going deeper. The vast majority of the books that we want to be reading on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, that we want to be studying regularly, that we want to be hearing, that khutbahs that we want to be hearing in reminders, should relate to this science. Because this formulates the basis through which is that all of our engagements after that, in relation to knowledge with other sciences, as well as anything that we do outwardly, is rooted in this reality, and to the degree that it is there, i.e. that our hearts are rectified and that they're in the proper state, will be to the degree which they were able to influence people positively and to bring about good here in this world. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all affairs. I'm terribly, terribly sorry for going that so much later. That we will probably just close here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, but very much looking forward to this weekend. This is that if you're only going to choose 5 to 7, I'm going to give the books of the Iḥyā to teach of the 40. It's very hard to even choose those 5 to 7 out of the 40, but that this book would definitely make that list. This is one of the most important, one of the very that valuable, that masterpieces of Islamic scholarship in the history of our ummah, and it will cover what it is that we can. Inshallah ta'ala, may Allah ta'ala open up our hearts to these meanings, and bless us to be able to put into practice, and from the barakah of coming together for His sake, and from the blessing of our shuyukh. May Allah Ta'ala make a reality in us those things that we're not even able to read, so that we have complete understanding, and this becomes how it is that we are, and that we attain the maqsood, the whole purpose of Imam al-Ghazali, that writing which is ultimately for you and I to travel the spiritual path, to rid ourselves of vices, or better said, to have Allah Ta'ala rid us of our vices and be adorned with virtues, so that we can be servants as He wants us to be and reach the higher degrees of closest to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all of our affairs. Ya Arhamar Rahimin, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.